All right, let's look at some of the theory now about this transition in the Neolithic Revolution. We looked a little bit about stages of culture in previous chapters, that in the 19th century, when archaeology was new, scholars tended to describe cultures moving through time as stages of advancement. And this is very colonialist and actually quite racist view of the past, that the United Kingdom in the late 19th century was seemed to be the pinnacle of human existence, and everybody else was sort of catching up. So looking at cultures from the past, it was trying to compare where they were in their progress towards the inevitability of the best, which was Western Europe. We now no longer think that that's the case, and in fact, you can go in multiple directions. You can go from hunting and gathering straight into industrialization, or you can go from industrialized it back into some other smaller scale form of culture or subsistence. So we try to do away with this concept of advancement and progress, especially. So we don't really want to talk about this in terms of moving from progressing in one, from hunting and gathering into the inevitability of what's better, which is agriculturalism and sedentism. And in fact, ethnographic studies that have been done on contemporary hunting and gathering communities, because there's still some people out there that live this way, show that they actually have a pretty good life. In fact, quite in some ways better than other types of lifestyles, industrialized world and small scale agriculturalist. The ethnographic analogies show that Tim Ingold in particular has showed that modern hunter-gatherers have a different worldview. They look differently at the world than we tend to today in our urban environments and that sort of state-level societies. They think differently about themselves in nature, that there's trust rather than domination over that nature, and there's autonomy versus dependence upon it. They live as autonomous entities within within nature, but they're also not separate from it. They're part of it. They're living in relative harmony with it. It's symbiotic, and so this has affected the way that we think about this transition from hunting and gathering into farming and herding. That sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? So why would you shift from one of trust and symbiosis with nature into one of domination and dependence upon it? Well, it may not have been conscious or intentional. And we once thought that this was sort of a light switch that went off. And Gordon Childe, although he's one of my heroes, he was sort of in this vein of there were revolutions. This comes from his Marxist way of thinking, that there was stages that you went through, and there was progress he saw in this, which we now don't think that we should use that word progress. So he saw, and he was the one who coined the phrase the Neolithic or the agricultural revolution, and he saw this as a major turning point for humans, which it was. This was described by people like Morgan as using the terms which were popular in the 19th century, from savagery to barbarism, as if that's a better thing, right? So the savages were the hunters and gatherers, and the barbarians were at least small-scale agriculturalists. And the barbarians at least had pottery, domesticated animals, plants, and they had permanent structures to live in. We don't use those terms anymore. So hunting and gathering, or foraging and hunting, are the terms that we use for a certain type of economy, the way that you live your life. But that also implies, and this is going to Marx's thought here, that when you find objects, material culture that relates to foraging, hunting, gathering as your economy, that also implies a certain type of social organization. Usually, you can't have a very large community because you can only exist on what you can only live on what exists in your area. You can only hunt a certain amount. You can only consistently and reliably. You can only move around seasonally, which means that moving big groups of people is hard. You might compete with other groups for resources, and you may need to be more adaptable. So small-scale communities with small numbers of people are pretty typical of hunting and gathering communities. This varies depending on what resources are available, however. So if you live, let's say, in an oasis, not just you are going to find the water. If you live in a marginal area like an arid environment and there's an oasis, you go there for water, but so do animals, so do plants. So you might actually have an abundance if there's some sort of a concentration of resources in one area. And as we'll see later on, there are some possibilities that sedentism took place before the idea of domestication did. Before the idea of controlling the environment, there were some sweet spots that people gathered around and created these so-called mega sites because there was so much available that maybe they didn't need to wander around finding resources. The resources were coming to them. So we need to think in terms of why did the change in attitude shift from one of living in relative harmony with nature into one of dominating and controlling it take place? Especially because there's also ethnographic and a lot of archaeological information that shows that early agriculturalists, when they made this shift into sedentism and farming, they had less healthy diet than hunters and gatherers. And this kind of makes sense if you think about it. I mean, it's a little counterintuitive that when you're farming and you're generating your own food, you have a lot of it, right? You should, but you're choosing which foods you're selecting, and it's limiting that. So you're devoting all of your time to producing wheat, which means your diet is going to be wheat. If you're not going out and getting a wide range of things, foraging and selecting different things, you're going to have a much more limited diet. Foragers and hunters, by definition, have a very broad range of nutrition. So the other thing that may have been a little bit down the line after people started living in agricultural societies was they needed to do things like sanitization was never a problem. You were moving around, so you never had to deal with things like human waste in your village, causing things like disease and vermin and rodents and all sorts of nasty things living in your communities and bringing diseases. Also, new diseases that are cycled around because there's crowds of humans. Crowd diseases start to spread. So you're less healthy, you're kind of gross, and and you might be diseased. That doesn't sound like progress to me. So why were they doing it? Why would humans choose to change in this way? Well, we know that they did, and it used to be thought, especially by people like Child, who talked about diffusionism, he thought this must be one bright idea that took place once and then spread out from there. This is diffusion. But we now understand that the Neolithic Revolution, early agriculturalism, took place in multiple places, at least 7 or 8 different places around the world at different times. The earliest of which we're going to talk in this chapter is from the Middle East, and then spread into Europe. But it started in the Middle East, and we're going to look at that later on in this chapter. But also in North America, Mesoamerica, the Andes Mountains in the New World. Also in Africa, in China, northern and southern, and in New Guinea. All of these places had independent inventions of agriculture. And here's the important thing. they started with different resources available because there were different ecosystems that they lived in. So wheat and barley and peas and lentils come from the Middle East because there were wild precursors to those there. There weren't these wild precursors in Mesoamerica. Instead, maize, corn, squash, and beans had wild precursors that were then domesticated in those locations. There were no cattle. There were no aurochs in South America, so you don't have cattle in South America until the European colonizers came. Same with things like horses. They didn't exist in North America after the Ice Age, and so they weren't an option. You couldn't domesticate horses in North America. The Native Americans couldn't do that because they weren't here in the Holocene, in the time that we're talking about here, after the Ice Age. So, why did agriculture begin? Well, one important thing is it was a possibility. In the Ice Ages, as we looked at before, there were these ups and downs of the climate. It was too unpredictable to be able to say, I want to develop this regime of reproduction of plants or animals, because the environment from one generation to the next may be too variable, and your techniques of cultivation may just have to go out the window. And so if that happens, you've got to scrap what you started on and move to another location anyway. So climate change, and actually climate stability, is extremely important. But also, I talked a little bit about this before, that we've seen humans expanding throughout the whole world. They kind of eventually ran out of new places to go. And once you do, if you are an expanding population of a hunting and gathering community, maybe you can have some people break away and move into different areas, if those areas are available. But if they're not available, then you either have to do something with the community you have and not move, or you've got to fight people for that territory. That probably did happen too. So there's probably both internal and external triggers of population size, climate change, and interpersonal relations that took place, population pressure, that can be used as explanatory movers here. So let's get into some other ideas about this as well. So it wasn't just, as Child said, a switch that flipped on. You know, suddenly you're checking your watch and, okay, agriculture now, let's do that. Let's throw out hunting and gathering. It seems to have been more of a process, that you had more generalized hunter-gatherers that may have been the result of scarcity of resources, and they started to adapt new ways of surviving. And so this created complex hunter-gatherers that produced high population densities, sometimes in these mega sites that I talked about before. And it looks as though this increasing complexity started, even though they were hunters and gatherers and they hadn't really domesticated plants and animals, it looks like increasing complexity may have preceded this shift in some cases. But other people say that there's actually a bit of variability here, and Kent Flannery's idea that complexity precedes the shift may not be a one-size-fits-all definition. Now, what happens with domestication of plants and animals, as I said, could be a slow process. Imagine this scenario. I talked about dogs before, but let's talk about something like wheat. There's a wild wheat species that exists in a field. You're a hunter-gatherer, you come across it, and you say, okay, this is great food. I really, this wild wheat is terrific. You come back the next year, you've remembered where that was, but you're a week later, and all the wheat has flown away, all the seeds are gone, except a few of the species that are on one end of that scale, that actually they're going to die in their husk because they didn't fly away with the wind to be dispersed and generate new plants. You might actually say, okay, there's not much here, but if I take these seeds and I put them into the ground and give them a fighting chance, those characteristics will be here when I come back next year, which means that you'll have more of these plants that waited a week, that waited longer, and eventually you'll have a species that you've generated that can only survive by being taken out and put into the ground by you and planted. And this creates a bit of work for you to get the seeds out. You've got to grind them up. You've got to take the seeds out of the husk. You've got to thresh them, and you've got to sort them. But then you've got a fairly reliable source of wheat food. Now, once you've bred these characteristics in, it no longer resembles. Maybe they've got fatter seeds. They've got tougher rachises, they're tougher and they brittle, so they break up so you can get to them. These are characteristics that aren't very successful in the wild, but they're what you want. And now you have a species of wheat that is less similar to the wild species and has become something else, but it's what you want. And now this may not necessarily be a conscious end product. You may not be thinking, all right, I'm several steps away from getting what I want. It may just be the process of saying, this is all that's available is this type of wheat, but if I plant it, it'll be here next time. And once it does that, it's a self-perpetuating process. So the domestication changes things like the shape and the size of plants and animals. It's outside of its natural range that the wild species would have. So these are the things that we want to look for if we're looking at archaeological materials that show animal bones. We want to see for changes or seeds of plants that remain. We want to look at if they're bigger or if their structure is different from wild species. We also can learn about this change from the type of tools start to change according to new strategies for survival. So it's not just that the plants and animals were adapting, but also that means if you have wheat that you need to chop up and get to the grains inside and then grind the grains to make beer or bread, you'll find tools that relate to that new type of practice. So farming tools, axes and sickles, processing like grinding stones, and then storage. You're going to have some excess. You've got a whole field of wheat that you've produced. What are you going to do with that? You can't eat it all in one sitting, nor would you want to. So you've got to actually have ceramic. This is where we see storage vessels like ceramics starting to crop up, and also things like structures like warehouses or storage rooms. And then that's the means of production, right? So the means of production is what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then how you organize that is the mode of production. So agriculturalist social organization also starts to change. And you can see that the settled community starts to think of their landscape not as a place that they live in, but a place that they own. It's their home. They've got to defend it because their life depends on it. You can't have some freeloaders coming in and eating your crop because that's all you've got now. You don't have the option to go back out hunting and gathering and wandering around. Your life depends on your home and your ability to defend it. So ownership of land also requires maybe a little bit of defense. Maybe you've got a social system that starts to divide up labor a little bit. You have a leader, and maybe you have a really strong person that can be your warrior. Or maybe you've got someone who's really good at this task or that task. So you start to divide up labor a little bit. Some people are farmers, some people are hunters, some people are herders, some people are builders, some people are leaders, and so on and so forth. So you can see that social organization centered around ownership, property, agriculturalism, dependence upon your crop and your flocks, starts to completely change the way you look at the world. Your cosmology changes. You start to see a hierarchy. Rather than you're part of nature, and there's this very hierarchical situation. It's hierarchical. You are at the top here, but maybe someone's above you, and maybe someone's above them, and maybe there's a God above all of that. So you start to see things like religion, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later on in this chapter, start to develop as part of a new way of looking at the way the world operates. I guess that's all I want to talk about right now. That's some of the theory around this. This is some of the things to think about when we're looking at the evidence. And so chapter 2 isn't just an irrelevant thing where we're just sort of talking to talk. Every time you come across new evidence, you've got to make sense of it. And the evidence that we're looking at in terms of about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, we started to move into a very stable climatic period where we started to change our attitudes towards survival. And we started to adapt the world to suit us rather than changing ourselves to suit the environment. All right, so we'll come back and we'll start looking at the earliest places where we found evidence for the Neolithic Revolution, which is in the Middle East. Come back, talk more about that.